All right, everyone, welcome to another episode of the Liam McCullum Show. I haven't done a podcast in a very long time. I finished up my final year at the University of Montana in my undergraduate, and I graduated. I was planning on going straight into law school this fall, but I decided to take a year off and kind of focus on work and my podcast and everything else I'm doing. I am also doing a lot of work with the Montana Libertarian Party right now with social media and so on. I was appointed the social media manager, and I'm doing other things with the Mises Caucus, as I've mentioned before. After I graduated, I went to the Reno convention, participated in what I think was a very historical moment for the Libertarian Party and the Libertarian movement as a whole. I think it's just going to only bring more attention to the Liberty movement and bring more people in. So I'm very excited for that, and I may have more opportunities when it comes to the Mises Caucus and the Libertarian Party at the national stage. There's some things that I'm talking about with some people right now, but I just wanted to take a year off and kind of reassess in a year and see if I want to go back to law school and kind of help build liberty in the state and also just get a job. Because I mean, I've been in school since kindergarten and I've never had more than 3 months where I've just been able to work a full-time job. And I hate feeling like a kid like that. So I'm finally going to go out and just have a regular schedule rather than just a crappy class schedule that is inconsistent. So I'm very excited for it. I finally admitted to myself that that's what I wanted to do, and it felt like a whole bunch of weight off my shoulders. So I'm not rushing the application process now, and I can kind of sit back and reflect on what I want to do. But today I figured that I would do just a solo episode on decentralization, specifically through the lens of Roe v. Wade and this most recent Supreme Court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. So as everyone knows, I'm sure now, on last Friday, the Dobbs decision was released and the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, which had been the precedent in the United States since 1973. So this overturning of Roe v. Wade has really motivated me to start thinking about decentralization, nullification, all the different avenues of decentralization and the ways that we can localize politics. It's been a huge concern of mine for a very long time, probably around 4 to 5 years now, maybe 6 years, that instead of focusing on the politicians at home who actually have an impact on your lives, we continue to delegate authority and delegate sovereignty to people who live 2,000 miles away from us. So people who live in DC have control over our lives, and we pay more attention to what they do than people in our hometowns, people who live next to us. We don't want to solve problems with the people around us. We want to shirk that responsibility and put it on people that live in DC. And there's some sort of comfort in that, but I think that it is very dangerous. Thomas Jefferson talked about how every government that has gone corrupt it's been attributed to centralizing and consolidating power into one entity. So I just wanted to talk about decentralization. And though I will be talking about Roe v. Wade, I think I'm going to do it more from somewhat of a dispassionate perspective rather than of the moral question of abortion. So I'm going to address the legality of it. I'm going to address why I think this is beneficial without really addressing the morality of the abortion question. But before I do that, I do want to say that I come from a perspective of I am pro-life. So I'm not going to get into moral questions about why I think it's right to be pro-life and why I think abortion is murder and should be prohibited. The question is more about decentralization and why that is good, separated from the question of abortion. So I think by the end of this, I will try to have made a case that even pro-choice people should be happy with the decentralization of politics. So first, I'm going to address Roe v. Wade, what happened, the implications of the decision of it overturning, a little bit about maybe the history of Roe v. Wade to the extent I know it, and then after that, just get into the general principle of decentralization. So I'm going to use Roe v. Wade as a lens to explore decentralization, and then defend decentralization on principle after, hopefully by the end of this. So the first thing about Roe v. Wade is that my concern with the case, separated from the moral question of abortion, is that what it essentially did is that it granted authority to the Supreme Court that the Supreme Court had not had before. So interestingly, even Ruth Bader Ginsburg was very critical of Roe v. Wade as it happened, and many people on the left were angry with her. There's an interview where Ruth is talking about how she thought that Roe v. Wade moved too far too fast. So there's a judicial philosophy that the Supreme Court should respect precedent and move slowly. It should not make very quick decisions. If it makes quick decisions, it has the potential to destroy the integrity of the court, because lower courts then have to change the way that they operate and so on. So it's more out of concern of the integrity of the Supreme Court, and not really out of a principle like a originalist interpretation of the Constitution. But she was very concerned with the fact that the Supreme Court, instead of just upholding, or instead of striking down the Texas law in question in Roe v. Wade, which was very restrictive, she was very worried that Roe v. Wade actually just made abortion legal in all 50 states, as abortion laws in the country were getting more liberal. So what she thought is that the Supreme Court should move very slowly, just strike down the very restrictive law, and then over time get to a point where the Supreme Court can make a final decision. But the fact that that hadn't been precedent before, and the Supreme Court, according to the Constitution, had no authority to talk about the abortion issue, I think she thought that it moved way too fast. And from my perspective, which is much more conservative when it comes to the Supreme Court, it's more that there are certain enumerated powers that the Constitution gives to the federal government, and they are enumerated. And the 10th Amendment says that outside of those, everything belongs to the state. And with many criminal things, the question belongs to the state. So the federal government can't say that certain practices in the state are legal or prohibited. Those are questions for state police powers. And I think by the Supreme Court hearing this case and even claiming that they have jurisdiction, what the Supreme Court did is they effectively ruled and gave themselves authority to have jurisdiction over a case that the Constitution makes no mention of. So you often hear people say, well, there is no constitutional right to abortion. That's not to say that abortion is prohibited in the country. It's to say that the Constitution makes no mention of it. So the Supreme Court is neutral on it. This is something that either people have to pass into law or states have to regulate and decide themselves. So by hearing Roe v. Wade, what effectively happened is there were two questions at hand, and this is acknowledged in the case. They were balancing the two liberty interests of fetal life and the right to get an abortion. So those liberty interests are acknowledged in Roe v. Wade. And effectively, what they were trying to do is pick one of them and balance the two liberty interests because they were conflicting. So by the Supreme Court hearing the case, they claim that they had jurisdiction to decide between two of those liberty interests, which is a political decision. So effectively, Roe v. Wade, I think, harms pro-choice people too, because what it did is it granted power to the Supreme Court to draw the lines on abortion. And it gave the power to the Supreme Court to eventually regulate abortion too. Because imagine if in 1973, instead what happened was that there was a conservative makeup of the court. And by conservative, I mean they have a conservative judicial philosophy. I don't mean they have conservative values. Those things can be separated, their actual conservative values with their judicial philosophy. So it's entirely possible to have someone who has a liberal judicial philosophy and believes that the Supreme Court is this entity that you can kind of push policy through, and you believe that the Constitution is a living Constitution, so you can kind of amend it. You believe that, the Constitution in no way, or the phrase you hear is the framers in no way could have expected that the Constitution wouldn't change, because they couldn't have expected, for instance, that we would have technology. So we kind of need to change the Constitution over time to fit it with modern applications. So that's kind of the liberal view of the court. So it's possible to have that perspective of what the Supreme Court is supposed to do, but also have conservative values, conservative social values. That tends not to be the case, but I'm saying that logically this is possible. So imagine if in 1973, the case Roe v. Wade comes to the Supreme Court, and the makeup of the court consists of justices with a liberal judicial philosophy, but conservative values. And Roe v. Wade effectively grants jurisdiction to decide between the two liberty interests of fetal life and abortion. And these conservative justices, since they believe that the court is made up of activist judges and they think that's okay, they decide to apply the 14th Amendment and the same exact legal reasoning used in Roe v. Wade, but to ban abortion across all 50 states. So they could either use the Equal Protections Clause of the 14th Amendment, or they could use the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, which is the clause that was used in Roe v. Wade to legalize abortion across all 50 states. So what they could say is, this doctrine of substantive due process, which allows us to find, what would we say? We would say emanations and penumbras in the Constitution that protect fetal life. They say, well, the Constitution clearly says that you can't take life, liberty, and property without due process. So they say, well, life is obviously protected there. So we can protect fetal life across all 50 states and ban abortion. They could do that, or they could say Equal Protection Clause. They could say, we're discriminating against fetal life in this case. We are protecting babies. And they can make a classification just out of nowhere and just push policy through that way. So that they could effectively have used the same legal principles and legal doctrines to do the exact opposite of what happened in Roe v. Wade in 1973. And what I would say is that I would be against that too, because I am opposed to centralization. And what is interesting about this is if that was the case, and that is what happened in 1973, and for 50 years, abortion was banned in this entire country. And then all of a sudden, 2022 comes along, and you have conservative justices who have a conservative judicial philosophy, but who have conservative values. They come along and they say, well, for how much we agree with the decision and we abhor abortion and we think that it is an evil, we recognize that the Constitution makes no mention of abortion. It does not give the federal government the ability to regulate it or have a say. So we are returning this to the people. We are returning this to the people and their legislators in their states. What would be funny about that is that it's the same exact legal reasoning, the same exact legal reasoning that was used in Dobbs on Friday, and the left would be celebrating it. And what's funny is that conservatives would likely also be celebrating it too. At the very least, libertarians would be celebrating it, because I think we need to be opposed to centralization, even if it goes in the direction that we like. So there's this hypothetical case where, suppose there was a world government and it mandates that everyone has to respect property rights, everyone has to respect liberty. I would move that we should not support that. And I think that the very practical reason for not supporting it is that we know that authority easily falls into people's hands that absolutely hate everything we believe. So imagine this world government then falls into the hands of a despotic leader, because the reality of the situation is, even if we had a dictator or a slow moving process, like constitutional process in this world government, over time, we know that this world is, from a Christian perspective, fallen. We also know that the world is, very corruptible, and that things are finite. And over time, empires collapse. Over time, governments collapse. They deteriorate. Institutions, their integrity is in question. They fall apart. And I think the risk is, the more practical and pragmatic risk that we have to acknowledge, is that these institutions will fall into the hands of people that we absolutely despise and disagree with. So for however long this institution that is a world government would protect property rights, eventually that won't be the case anymore. And there will be this net that encases the entire world. And now everyone is behind essentially bars, and their liberty is restricted, because you have built this cage around yourself. And, for how much I agree with the Supreme Court decision, at least in the sense that abortion, so like if the Supreme Court were to have banned abortion, for how much I would have agreed with the moral question of the case, I acknowledge that in the case of Roe, Casey, and Dobbs, there's a more fundamental question at hand that goes beyond the abortion question. And that is of how much authority the Supreme Court of the United States should have. Should we increase it or should we decrease it? What Roe and Casey did was increase the power of the Supreme Court and the authority, the jurisdiction. So it's more of a jurisdictional question than I think it is an abortion question. Obviously, Roe and Casey were very activist in that they were imposing the worldview that the judges liked, but the legal reasoning used was, because that was the moral reasoning, but the legal reasoning used was a jurisdictional legal reasoning. And I'm saying that we should reject that from both sides, because if you're pro-choice and what happens is instead you wait 50 years after Roe v. Wade, and instead 2022 comes along and you don't have conservative justices with conservative values, you have liberal justices with conservative values, and they just ban abortion across all 50 states because you set the precedent allowing for the Supreme Court to decide between the two liberty interests. Because the truth is, and I think most people and ethicists who are focusing on the abortion question are acknowledging that the viability case for abortion is going to make, or the viability element of abortion is going to make, and the medical advancements are going to make this abortion question very complicated over time. And I think, Roe and Casey, I think it was eventually Casey that established the principle of viability and clearly defined it. And the thing is that if that is the very arbitrary, line that you're drawing, viability moves a lot. Like we have these medical advancements that it will be in probably 10 years possible for babies to grow and live outside of the womb. That's an entire possibility. And then if that is your condition that you're basing the entire legal doctrine on, it becomes very shaky. So that's all to say, like, I think that the moral question here is going to change a lot over time. And the real question that we need to be acknowledging in Roe, Casey, and Dobbs is the jurisdictional question. Because as these moral questions advance, I think that we need more leniency to be able to experiment and to be able to have these ethical conversations and to figure out where the lines are. But if you have a fixed one-size-fits-all solution imposed down on all 50 states by one body of 9 people, I think what we run the risk of is just not having the freedom and the liberty to really associate and voluntarily associate with people that we agree with, that have the same ethical standards that we do. And, we would run the risk of not being able to have, we would run the risk of not being able to have experimentation with policy. So, it's often described as the federal system as the ability to have laboratories of democracy. And I think by consolidating power into the Supreme Court, we totally removed the possibility for different states to have different policies and us to really find the line. Like, for how pro-life I am, there are so many people in this country who, are very moderate. It's more of like a safe, legal, and rare standard. And I think that we need to have more flexibility. And the way that you do that is to localize and decentralize. And I think another benefit of decentralization is that it's a defense of your own values. It's not necessarily an endorsement of the other people's values and a tolerance of it. So for how much I think that abortion is evil, by saying that I think that we should decentralize and that people should go into New York and people should go into California, and everyone who believes in abortion should just live in those states and they should do whatever they want. That's not me saying that I endorse what they're doing. I think it's evil. What I'm saying is that I'm giving myself the power to carve out a part of this world, a part of this country where my values are preserved and where I know that my values will be recognized and where I can associate with people that I agree with. Now, I know that states are still really big. Like, my ideal would be to decentralize even more, make it a county issue, make it a city issue. Because I think that both sides, whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, should recognize that, there is another side that wants to wield power and crush your worldview. So to accept decentralization is not to, like I said, endorse their worldview, but to kind of declare a truce, because that down the road, they will use violence against you if you remain in the same political dimension. Declare a truce on the federal dimension, the federal scale, and then pull back and preserve your worldview at a local level, and then begin changing hearts and minds by implementing policies that make sense, that are convincing, and actually using, arguments and care and being able to talk to people about issues. Because I think that what happens when we nationalize these topics is that it becomes, because there's so much at stake and because we've essentially nationalized politics, what ends up happening is the stakes are very high and it becomes more argumentative. Like we are fighting over one presidential position, just the president's seat. the presidency, because they have more and more authority over our lives, that we begin to miss each other when we're talking, because there's no ability for us to just carve out a space in our lives where we live with people that we agree with. There's no breathing room, and it becomes very consequential who sits on the Supreme Court. It becomes very consequential who becomes the president, because there's just so much at stake. So instead, if we just roll it back, we take a breath from both sides, we can begin to actually have a dialogue on these issues. And I think things will become less vitriolic over time. So for how much people are protesting right now, and for how much people are out in the streets, the funniest thing is that people are protesting in California, even though abortion will remain legal in California. They're, rioting in California when they could go to other states that are pro-life, and advocate for pro-choice people there. And, maybe pro-life people should go to pro-choice states and advocate for pro-life in those states. But also maybe it would be the right thing just to not do that, and to, sit back in your state and create culture in your state that you agree with. Because I do think that decentralization is a peaceful remedy. I think that the path of this country, I think most people are recognizing that a national conflict is possible. As we continue to increase authority, in the presidency, we have more and more accusations of elections being stolen. We have more and more accusations of, people being evil, and like people calling for people's lives. I mean, as soon as this Supreme Court decision came through on Friday, people were calling for Clarence Thomas's death. There was a photo of Donald Trump and his cut off head. I forget who that actress was. So instead, if we just declared a truce on the federal level, and we said these issues that divide us are going to continue to divide us, and if they remain a question that exists on this national stage, things will get more violent. I think we need to acknowledge that, and just maybe, just declare a truce on the national stage, so we can sit back and, red states will get redder, blue states will get bluer. People who are in red states will probably move to blue states if they disagree. And if they don't have the capability to, because they're poor, we have the capability in this country to create peaceful solutions for that. Nonprofits, we have the ability to, states can implement policies too, but that wouldn't be my preference. But like California and New York are talking about funding people to get to blue states if they need an abortion. And corporations are already saying that they're going to offer up to, I think, like $5,000 to their employees if they need to travel to go get an abortion. So like, all I'm suggesting is that we take these current questions out of the most consequential political realms and we just roll them back, because I think that will be beneficial to everyone. So I've tried to make this more of a dispassionate look at it. If I am passionate, it's towards decentralization. I've tried to separate my moral views from the decentralization question, which is what I think the Supreme Court should have done initially in 1973. I think that they made a grave mistake in guaranteeing abortion to 50 states while these states were actually liberalizing their laws, because then I think they made a very false promise and a false promise of security to these people. And now that they've ruled that they're neutral on the issue, which is what they did. They didn't say that they didn't declare that abortion is banned across all 50 states. They said the Supreme Court is neutral on it. It's up to the states. I think by doing that, after 50 years of having abortion legal in this country, it really, people are saying that they were deprived of a right, which isn't the case. The states will end up being the ones who regulate the issue if they do, but that's not necessary. There will be states that don't, like California and New York. but the security, that the guarantee that they gave the people, the pro-choice people in the 1973, I think just pacified them. It really goes to the entire lesson that I've been talking about, that over time, who fills those institutions will change. And it was totally possible that down the road, conservative justices would have banned abortion across all 50 states. It would have been the outcome that I liked. I would have liked the moral decision there. But there is still a moral element involved that deals with sovereignty and delegating your sovereignty and your responsibility to some board, and consolidating authority to some board filled with people who wear robes for a living, and just ceding some of your own personal responsibility over to them. So I think that, that is something that we really need to step away from. And I think that over time, I think it's totally possible that in 6 months, people aren't as radicalized over this issue, because really, people who live in blue states will continue to live in blue states, and people who live in red states will continue to live in red states. And if they agree with their policies. And I also think that fundamentally the moral question and the moral conversation will begin to actually advance forward. To get into just a little aside about my own personal views that has nothing and is not dependent on everything that I've said so far, I think that we have got caught up in, high time preference behaviors, high credit environments with the Federal Reserve lowering interest rates and just handing out money, and having all of this abundance because of this artificial growth. And I think what we've created is a culture that is so focused on material and bodily pleasure and being able to satisfy your wants whenever you want, that I think that as the institutions start to shake a little more, as the economy starts to break apart, as the moral question of abortion gets challenged, I think that people are actually going to end up reevaluating a lot of their values. I think they will be kind of required to by the nature of things, by the nature of just the natural laws. Like as the economy gets weaker and as we don't have abundance, people are going to start paying attention to their local towns more. The issues that are more fundamental, that I think are more of a North Star, or should be the North Star for a lot of people, which, is religion for me. But I think that even if people aren't religious, they will start to pay attention to family more. They will be more grateful for what's on their table. And maybe what will come with that is less, licentious and libertine behaviors, and people will begin to value life more. And this is all to say that, for those people who are pro-life, don't look to government like the pro-choicers did for the last 50 years. Try to actually advance culture, try to influence people in your homes, in your neighborhoods, in your churches, in the organizations you run. Try to have a sense of understanding and realize that part of the reason that abortion has become like oxygen in this country, it's present and everyone has been desensitized to it, is because we've created this culture. This was something that happened gradually. And we are now at a point where it just seems like a norm, but that will change. That can change. So that's just to say, let's not return to enforcing our values down on people from the Supreme Court or Congress. Let's try to influence people at home and influence the people that we see daily when we go to work, when we're living our daily lives. I think that this is the way forward, where the 20th century was kind of the modernization of the progressive era, Woodrow Wilson, and with that came centralization. I think that we can make the 21st century a century of decentralization and, voluntary association. And I don't think that naturally has the tendency to agree with one particular worldview. I think that all worldviews can benefit from that, even if you vehemently disagree with the other side. I think that it is fundamentally better to have a society where you can carve out a little space in the country and preserve a little bit of good and be that one place and that, what do you call it? A light on a hill, where you're the only one standing up for good, than to have a system that imposes darkness across all 50 states. So whatever side that you fall on, I think that it is better to create systems that allow for that flexibility than to grow the power of the institution such that there's no ability for dissenters. There is no ability for people to create sanctuaries for their beliefs. And, you run the risk of having one side of the political debate. You run the risk of the side that's not your own being able to crush you, because while you were in authority, you grew that institution. So it's just a little bit of wisdom of, as you're using authority and as you continue to set precedents, and as you continue to grow power, know that you won't always sit in that position, that everyone will die. Everyone who currently is alive will die, and more people will take over those institutions. And eventually your worldview, almost by necessity, will wear away and decay from the system. So to kind of talk more about decentralization and the history of decentralization and how I think that it has supported freedom and kind of demonstrates what I'm talking about right now. And the more profound example that I always go to is when Wisconsin nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act essentially nationalized slavery, and that if a slave crossed state lines, they would have to be returned to their slave owner. Even if a state went from Texas and they traveled to South Dakota. Fugitive Slave Act essentially created this police state whereby people were, ordered to return slaves to their slave owners. So Wisconsin, they stood up. And I think in one of the most, like I said, profound cases of decentralization, they nullified it. And they said that anyone who comes to Wisconsin, any free man or freed man that flees to Wisconsin will become free, and you will be a sanctuary for here. And I think, often what gets lost about the whole history of the Civil War discussion is that a lot of people look to the South as examples of decentralization and localization, but they're actually a perfect example of centralization. Part of the reason that they wanted to secede from the United States is that the federal government wasn't forcing northern states to follow federal law. So what ended up happening after the Confederation became a conglomerate of states again is that the Confederacy, the Constitution, didn't allow any state in the Confederacy to then ban slavery. So it became very centralized even within the system that broke off from the United States. And I mean, that's all to make the case that I don't think that the Confederacy is the example of decentralization, nullification, or secession that people make it out to be. I think the better case is states like Wisconsin, who really stood up to power, and they were that light, the good in the only good that really existed in a country that was filled with darkness. So I think that's kind of the lesson. And there are many historical examples that I could point to even before the United States became a thing. Like, the city of Magdeburg pushing back against the Roman Empire. There are cases like in Montana that I think that are great. So the Real IDs, Governor Schweitzer stood up to the Real IDs and said that we would not accept Real IDs in Montana. And I mean, how many years has it been? We still don't have Real IDs in Montana. Some people do, but you're not required to. And, they threatened to pull funding, and he called their bluff. So I think that as a general principle, we should agree with localization, even when, it's at the risk of losing ground on the national stage. So two of my favorite, or two of the biggest influences on me, Murray Rothbard and Ron Paul. They were on opposite sides of the abortion question. So Ron Paul was pro-life. Murray Rothbard was pro-choice. Ron Paul was pro-life because he delivered, I think, hundreds of babies during his career, and he witnessed an abortion, and it had, a profound effect on him. Murray Rothbard had a more philosophical answer to abortion, and I think it was that babies can't appeal for their rights. I don't remember specifically what his argument is, but what matters is that they were on different sides, but what they agreed on is that they shouldn't centralize power. So there's an introduction, I think it's Ethics of Liberty, where Hoppe is talking about Rothbard, and he says for how pro-choice he was, he would have disagreed with Roe v. Wade because it centralized authority into the Supreme Court. And then when Ron Paul was running for president, he was asked by, I think it was a Republican commentator, why he didn't support a national amendment prohibiting abortion, which I think constitutionally it would have to be an amendment, even though Democrats want to pass a bill legalizing it. I think it would have to be an amendment because, again, it's not mentioned in the Constitution. The only way that you can really do it, I think, is through the Commerce Clause, but you really have to bend it. And I mean, it's not like the Supreme Court hasn't done that before, though. So, but the current makeup, I think, would strike down a law that legalize abortion in this country. But even when confronted with the constitutional way to do it, with an amendment, Ron Paul opposed it. He said, I'm not a big fan of big government. Like that power can be taken from you, can be used against you if you grow it. We should be opposed to centralization. And I think that those two people really show the wisdom in the concept of decentralization, that like they could fundamentally disagree on the moral question, but have peace and come to an agreement that they're going to declare a truce in the realm where political coercion is used. Libertarianism, it's concerned with only one question, and that is, what is the legitimate use of violence? And their answer is in defense. After someone has initiated violence against you or initiated force against you, you can use violence in response. So there's unity, and there's kind of a balance there. That's the appeal. And I mean, it's really why it's beautiful. And, on the question of violence, Ron Paul, Murray Rothbard declared a truce, even though they disagreed with the morality of this. They said, we should decentralize power. We should try to, rid the world of as much aggression as possible, if we can. And I think that just shows how kind of beautiful the concept of nullification and decentralization and localization, whatever term you want to use. I think it's just a beautiful concept that I hope can, bring the left and the right together on the political questions and the jurisdictional questions. I don't think we will ever agree on the moral questions, but hopefully we can agree that violence and the use of coercion to force each other to accept our worldview is actually, for how utilitarian and how beneficial that might be to us in the short term, in the long term, it's going to be very harmful to our cause, because eventually different people will take hold of that office. Ethical considerations will change. And then we made the fatal error of growing power to then be crushed by it later. So I hope to do more conversations on the question of decentralization, hopefully interview more people and about it who agree. And also then, actually demonstrate my, and actually live out my principles by interviewing people at the local level who are advancing the cause of liberty here. So I'm planning on doing more interviews about judicial accountability in Montana. There are many bills that are being passed in Montana or being introduced in Montana that have nullified power. There are many that I missed in 2021 that got passed that I would love to cover too. I think they're evergreen since they are now law, and I think they're pretty extraordinary bills. But then also I am getting in contact with many people in Montana who are legislators. Also, Lee Deming, who I've had on the show before, he was elected to House District 55. There's no Democrat running in the race, and he won his primary. So I'm going to have him more on the show, and I'm also going to be hopefully working with him on legislation and getting things passed in Montana that I think will help decentralize power. States have the capability to nullify federal law and localize federal law. So an example is there was this bill passed, I think in 2021, that said, I think it was 2021, that said that no official in the state, so no state or local official, can assist federal officers in the enforcement of certain gun control in the state. So I think they define this pretty broadly. So that's federal rules. So like ATF rules, that's legislation, that's what would it be? Executive orders. So now certain, regulations at the federal level will not be enforced by state officials or local officials. So that's an example where, in relation to the federal government, we do have the ability to, and the power really, to nullify and reject things that are happening in a centralized manner. An argument that is made is there's only a limited amount of ATF officials, and often they have to rely on localities to follow through with these regulations and to serve warrants and stuff like this. It's the same with marijuana. That's why marijuana is still illegal on the federal level, but states ignore it and they get by. So those are ways that we can move forward, and a principle that I think we can move forward on things in our state that we agree with. And I think, that ATF bill, it centralized power in one sense. It took power away from localities. And I think that there is an argument that maybe we allow cities like Missoula to develop their own rules. And, if it becomes so tyrannical that people want to move away from Missoula, then we can create systems and organizations that can help people do that, because the rest of the state is red. So yeah, I hope that I have made a convincing case for centralization on principle. I've tried to appeal to historical examples and practical examples, and why it might be the moral, practical, historical thing to do. And I hope I made a good case. And, if you like this episode, give it a like on YouTube or whatever platform you're listening to it on. Share it around, start a conversation in the comments section. Leave a review of my podcast, depending on the platform you're on. Also, follow me on social media. I'm at MLIAM McCullum on Twitter. I wanted to do this podcast because I went viral on Twitter. I think it was I think it ended up with around 70,000 likes on Twitter. I'll post the tweet here for people who are watching, but people who are listening over audio, I'm quoting AOC, and I say, the right to our bodies does not belong to 9 Supreme Court justices. And then I have SCOTUS responding saying, that's literally what we said. And it's currently at 69.7 thousand likes. It got 681 quote tweets and 14,000 retweets. I think Ben Shapiro was one of the people who retweeted it, which was just crazy. If that happened to me in high school, I would have lost it. I listened to Ben Shapiro all the time in high school, but I've kind of stepped away from his podcast because we disagree on foreign policy, even though he claims that he's a libertarian. But that's for a future podcast. Like I said, give me a like, subscribe, share this around, follow me on social media, and I hope to see you next time.